thank you for making time in your lunch to join us. Feel free to eat. If you have questions, you can come off mute or you can put something in the chat. Robin will be monitoring the chat. And Robin will also put the briefing document into the chat. So that contains links to things I'm going to refer to so that you can follow up with them, and she'll also share that with you after the call. The biggest thing that is happening on the national level right now is the budget deliberations that are happening in Washington right now. The first hurdle for passing the Republican proposal was passed late Sunday night. The Budget Committee passed the budget out of committee. It is now at the Rules Committee. They scheduled a meeting for the Rules Committee last night, starting at 1 a.m. And are still going. They have not reached an agreement as of 10 minutes ago when I just checked. In the Budget Committee, what was initially in the proposed budget last Friday included a number of provisions that would be harmful for nonprofits. The biggest one was pulled from the budget before the Budget Committee voted on Sunday night. So that provision was essentially the text of what was called HR 9495 last congressional session. That would allow the Treasury Secretary to unilaterally decree any nonprofit to be a terrorist supporting organization and revoke their 501c3 status without due process. That is obviously hugely concerning for us. There was a lot of national advocacy over the weekend, so we were really glad to see that it was pulled from the bill that passed the Budget Committee late Sunday night, early Monday morning. That doesn't mean it can't get reinserted into the bill, but it is currently not part of the bill. It also has the potential to be voted on as a standalone bill in the House. The other factor, the reason it may have been pulled out, in addition to all the advocacy that nonprofits were putting on Republican House members, is that it didn't have a financial implication. So technically in the Senate, anything that is in the budget bill that goes before the Senate has to have a financial implication because they are using the reconciliation process. And the reconciliation process means you can pass something with only a majority vote, so just 51 votes, but everything in it has to have a budget implication. So the HR 9495 language did not have a budgetary implication, and so there was also a chance that the parliamentarian could pull it out. So as of today, what they are debating does not include the HR 9495 language, which we're really grateful for. Like I said, we still need to be really vigilant about that, and we're going to see it pop up in other ways, but it is not currently in the budget bill. There are there's significant cuts to social services in the current budget, as well as a few nonprofit specific implications. So I just wanted to highlight a few of them. It would have the largest cut to SNAP, which is food stamps, in history. It has the potential to cut between 7 to 14 million people off Medicaid, which could be devastating not only for individual families, but for the state as a whole, which relies on Medicaid funding to support a lot of different social services, behavioral health services, and education. It has cuts to education and clean energy. It would increase military and border border security funding. It would add $2.3 trillion to the deficit over the next decade, because it would make permanent the tax cuts that Trump did in his first administration. So there would be a significant tax cut for wealthier Americans and corporations, according to the Congressional Budget Office. In 2027, the bottom 10% of Americans, so the lowest income Americans, would lose 2% of their income because of this, this bill and the cuts and benefits. The top 10% of earners in the US would increase their income by 4%. So we're seeing that the tax cut for the wealthiest 10% is going to result in a net loss for the lowest 10% in terms of income. There's also, because it increases the deficit so significantly, this would also trigger what's called pay-go, which would be, use another term, sequestration, meaning compulsory. It would trigger compulsory cuts to Medicare of $45 billion in 2026 and $490 billion from 2027 to 2034. So we've heard a lot about the Medicaid cuts. So that is support for low-income individuals to provide health insurance, as well as support for health-related social needs. And so we've heard a lot about that, and that would be devastating. But the Congressional Budget Office just released their calculations that demonstrate that it would also result in this compulsory cut to Medicare, which is the senior health insurance program. President Trump on the campaign trail had promised that there would be no cuts to Medicare, Medicaid, or Social Security. And he has, when he visited the Republican caucus on Capitol Hill yesterday, the day before, he said again he didn't want to see any cuts to Medicaid. There are already cuts to Medicaid listed out in the bill, but this would also trigger Medicare cuts. Unless the House directed the Congressional Budget Office to essentially ignore the debt impact, and I'm not sure exactly how that would work, but as of now, it would result in significant cuts, not only to Medicaid, but Medicare. And so that is pretty much new as of today. That Congressional Budget Office letter just came out about Medicare. The other particular issues in the budget, beyond the huge cuts to social services and to the communities that we serve, are there's a couple of specific issues for nonprofits. So the revoking the tax exempt status language could find its way back into the bill, so we just want to be really vigilant about that. There is also a significant increase to the excise tax on foundations. It would increase about, so it would increase to up to 10% on private foundations with very large assets over $5 billion. It would greatly reduce the financial resources available to foundations to grant out to nonprofits. So that is something that the Alliance opposes, because we want to make sure that as much funding as possible comes from foundations to nonprofits. Another provision in the bill is it would create a 1% floor for charitable contributions by corporations. So right now, corporations can deduct whatever charitable contributions they make to nonprofits when they're doing their taxes. This would say that any donations that they make up to 1% of their revenue would not be deductible. So a lot of corporations give more than 1%, and so the deduction would kick in if they do more than 1%, but for companies, particularly smaller companies that may give less than 1%, they wouldn't get any incentive to make charitable donations because they're not reaching that floor of 1%. So again, as the Alliance, we are in opposition to that because we want, again, incentives to ensure that charitable contributions are being made by every size business. There's also a provision that would limit the value of itemized deductions for high income taxpayers. So they would be limited to 35%. We, again, don't want to see anything that would remove incentives for charitable giving. So that is something that we would like to see removed from the bill. There is the bill characterizes transportation or parking benefits that are provided by nonprofits to their employees. It characterizes that as unrelated business income, or UBIT. So that would be subject to a tax. Now that doesn't make sense because it isn't income, it's actually an expense. But this provision was part of the original tax cut bill in President Trump's first term. This particular provision was revoked after there was subsequent legislation that took this provision out of the bill because it doesn't make sense. But right now it is in the bill. And so if a nonprofit provided transportation, like a bus pass to employees, or if they provide parking, that would be counted as income that would be taxed. We obviously oppose that. There's also some additional taxes on colleges and university endowments. It also creates a tax if a nonprofit licenses their name or logo, then that would be subject to unrelated business income tax. There were also, let's see, they are also, the one good provision of the bill is that it does include an incentive for charitable giving. There was a universal charitable deduction that expired during COVID, and since then we have seen individual charitable giving decline. High income earners itemize their deductions and therefore are able to get essentially a tax benefit for making those charitable donations. But lower income families who don't itemize and take the standard deduction have not gotten any benefit from making charitable donations. This would put a very small tax deduction back into the options for non-itemizing tax filers. It would be $150 for a single person and $300 for a joint filer. It is limited to only go through 2028. So we would like to see this expanded and made permanent, but it is a good thing that it is in the bill. Senator Lankford has been a champion of that on the Senate, and there are, I'm not sure who the Republican champions for that are in the House, but we are grateful that that is in there because we obviously want to have incentives for charitable giving. Robin put in the chat a chart that talks about the different issues that are in the tax bill, but we are really encouraging nonprofits to reach out to the congressional delegation. We have already let them know about the primary issues that I just related to you, but it's really important that they hear from actual nonprofits about how important it is to remove most of these provisions, and also to expand and make permanent the tax deduction for charitable giving. So we have on the policy briefing document, we have kind of the 4 talking points that are national talking points. And then the 5th thing we have is a link to our local Protect Social Services advocacy campaign that we're doing to both our state legislature and to our congressional delegation, telling them how important it is to protect social services in the fiscal year 26 budget. So you can just click on that link, and then it will send you put in your address, it'll automatically send information to your state rep, your state senator, the leadership of the Senate and the House in Rhode Island, and then to the congressional delegation. So we really ask you to take action on that and share that link with others. Any questions on the federal budget? Okay. Also on the federal level, in the original executive orders that the White House released.
Raised hand from Karen Jeffries.
Sorry, I didn't. Oh, do you have further information on the education cuts? I do not, but I will see if I can get them for you.
Hey, Nancy.
Yeah.
This is Melissa from the Coalition Against Gun Violence. How are you? Thank you for getting all this information together. It's, as you know, it's like information overload every day. I have one specific question. One of the things I had read was that healthcare premiums could go up significantly. Like I read as much as 85%. And I was just thinking about the way that could affect nonprofits, and that, we're paying for health insurance for our employees. And that could be a significant cost increase. And I'm just wondering, is that just because the system's going to be so overwhelmed that just prices of everything are just going to go up because so many more people just won't have insurance? Is that the reasoning behind that?
That is, at least in part, it is, I don't understand all the dynamics, but it is a result of the Medicaid cuts will result in everybody's premiums going up. So yes. Karen?
Yeah, thanks. Just a quick question to clarify. So what we're looking at right now on the federal level is the budget, because we've been hearing cuts like to the LGBTQ line for 988, but they are saying September for that because that's the programs, right? So the budget is separate from the program side that's going to come out in the fall. Is that correct?
So this is essentially the framework.
Yep.
For the budget. So it's not down to the programmatic level. So we're seeing kind of this aligned path of there are department level cuts that we're seeing, agency level cuts that we're seeing, which are partially DOGE, which are partially ideological, kind of rooting out things that they don't think should be there. And then there's this big picture of how we're going to make the whole federal government budget work. And so they are not down to the program level on the whole big umbrella picture, but in terms of the targeted policy cancellations, that's what the LGBTQ line is a result of.
Okay, and so that leaked budget that we saw like a couple of weeks ago, that is really their program budget, that program changes that they're going to be putting in probably later this summer?
So the leaked budget was the president's budget. And that is essentially what he wants. That's not necessarily what Congress is going to do.
Okay.
So that's but what we're seeing is that the agencies are arbitrarily making those decisions to align with what the president wants, even though money has been allocated. And so that doesn't mean that it's not just going to end up following what the president has said, even if Congress makes some different decisions, because what we've seen in the last year is that Congress made some decisions and the agencies aren't following the decisions that they made. But the program year starts October 1st.
Right.
So that would be, you know, what the president would like to see happen would be that and other programs being canceled as of the new program year.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions on that? Well, not on that specifically, but the other thing I started talking about is that when the initial executive orders were released right after the inauguration, there were several executive orders around diversity, equity, inclusion. And one of the action steps in there was directing federal agencies to come up with a list of nonprofits to be investigated. So nonprofits, foundations, universities, particularly those with large endowments. The deadline he gave for that list was today. So we are expecting today, tomorrow, next week, sometime soon, a list of nonprofits, foundations, and universities that are going to be targeted for investigation. Obviously, the president has said that he wants to revoke Harvard's nonprofit status because he feels that they haven't complied with what he thinks they should be complying with. So there's also an expectation that in the list of investigations, they will potentially also include recommendations about revoking nonprofit status. The president does not have the authority to unilaterally revoke nonprofit status. He also, by law, cannot direct the IRS to revoke nonprofit status or even to do an investigation into a nonprofit. We have seen things happen that aren't in line with what regulations and current legislation says is legal. So I can't say that that's not what they're going to do, but he does not have the authority to do that. But National Council of Nonprofits has been working with other civil society partners to be ready so that when something is released that does attack the nonprofit status of one or more nonprofit organizations, we will have a sign-on letter that is ready to go within 4 to 6 hours. That is already available for signature. So if you would like to sign it, there is a link in the document, basically being in solidarity to say that is an executive branch overreach and that they should not be attacking nonprofits and revoking nonprofit status. So we encourage you to sign on to that letter and to share it with others so that that is ready to go when and if we see an attack on the sector. We also have seen that nonprofits have been doing very well in court and are working closely together with the Lawyers Committee so that if there is like a class action or additional litigation to be brought around any of these issues, we can work closely with them to make that a reality. So what's really important is that you let us know if you have a termination to a federal funding source, if you have a pause in a federal funding source, or if you receive a request for certification, so that you have to certify to say that you are in alignment with the government's DEI policies or with executive orders. We really want to make sure that you have legal counsel before you fill any of those out. Some of you also may have need to do justifications now when you draw down federal funding that may include essentially a certification. We would love to connect you with the Lawyers Committee so that you can be protected, because the Attorney General also just created this civil rights fraud task force, essentially to pursue False Claims Act violations by organizations that they think have discriminatory practices in their interpretation of what is illegal DEI activities. DEI in itself is not illegal and is in compliance with existing civil rights laws, but we are seeing that as a potential next front, an attack for nonprofits. So we want to know as soon as possible if you have any of those requests or demands from the federal government so that we can provide you support ASAP. In terms of litigation, we have seen that there was a lawsuit regarding the Institute for Museum and Library Services. A federal judge in Rhode Island ruled that the president could not shut down that agency and he could not terminate the funding for that. So that funding should be being restored to museums and libraries. The U.S. Institute for Peace, which is a nonprofit that was created by Congress but functions independently as a nonprofit, was targeted by DOJ and to be shut down. They kicked people off the board, instituted a new board that closed the organization, and they took control of the building that was owned by the nonprofit. A court in DC has ruled that all of that was unconstitutional and was therefore null and void. So that's just an important precedent, because that was an independent nonprofit that DOJ went into and shut down and appropriated their properties. So that is a good precedent. We obviously expect a lot of these things to be appealed up to higher courts, but in lower courts, this litigation is being really successful. So the last thing is that the SAVE Act, which is a bill that would eliminate the ability for folks to register to vote online or in voter registration drives, that passed the House. And it is now moving over to the Senate. So we still have a lot of concerns about that, because it would be really difficult for some individuals who have transportation issues, who might be homebound, who have health issues, to be able to get to the Secretary of State's office to register or to make changes to their registration. They also may not have documentation necessary to do that. And it would also mean that nonprofits could not do voter registration because it wouldn't allow for remote registration. So just wanted to give you a heads up that that did pass the House, but it is heading to the Senate, where it will require 60 votes. But it is also something you may want to weigh in on. A couple other federal issues. AmeriCorps was essentially halted. About 85% of the staff have been dismissed, and AmeriCorps grants have been terminated. There's an opportunity to advocate for AmeriCorps on the budget, the briefing document. There's also Head Start Head Starts have been given kind of a provision. They were due to be renewed for 5 years this spring, but are getting renewed just until September. So that's concerning. It may mean that they were not included in the president's budget. And so we are concerned about that. There's also an opportunity to send a letter about that in the briefing document. There's an opportunity to send a letter about SNAP, the food stamp program, also in the briefing document. So, any other questions about federal issues? Okay, state level issues. You may have heard there's a nonprofit disclosure bill that was submitted in the House and the Senate. Initially, the bill said that it would require nonprofits to submit to the General Assembly and put on their website the salaries and benefits of their top 10 paid employees, as well as disclose all of their funding sources. This obviously higher end salaries are already available on a 990 document, or you can go through any of the Charity Navigator, GuideStar systems to get that. And so I testified at the hearing saying, number one, that if they're concerned about high salaries, that information is already publicly available, and that the actual issue in the nonprofit sector is low compensation, and it is at a crisis point where it impedes the ability of nonprofits to be able to recruit and retain employees because they are underpaid. We also worked with the House sponsor who did incorporate a number of our suggestions. So she submitted an amended bill that was voted on last night, and it made it out of committee. We were glad to see that she incorporated a lot of our recommendations into the bill, so that now there is no requirement about posting on a website. It is only 3 employees, not 10. It is also only employees making over $100,000, which is the same threshold as on a 990. It also doesn't include disclosing all revenue sources. There was a question about donor privacy, and so that is no longer in the bill. So we still feel like it's not a necessary bill because the information is available on 990s, but it is at least now in a form that is in alignment with other publicly available information. And so we aren't opposing it anymore. But just to give you a heads up that she is very concerned about a few bad apples in the sector whose salaries she feels are not in line with what they should be. And so she may be active in vocalizing that moving forward. So I will give you a heads up about that. The Senate, during the hearing, the bill sponsor wasn't really strongly pushing for it to be passed. So I don't know what the prospects are of getting out of committee on the Senate side, but we will definitely be advocating for the same changes that went into the bill on the House side. So advocacy works. It's a much better, less invasive bill than it originally was. But you are welcome to weigh in, particularly on the Senate side, if you have would like to on that. The nonprofit audit threshold bill, which is would increase the audit threshold for the state for nonprofits with revenues. Currently, it's $500,000, and it would move it to be $1 million. That passed unanimously in the House. We are still waiting. We had a good hearing in Senate Finance Committee, and we are waiting for Senate Finance Committee to vote on it. They're still considering budget items and have not started voting on bills that are not budget items. And so we're still optimistic. The Senate Finance Chair is a co-sponsor of the bill, so we're optimistic, but we don't have a date on that yet. And the last thing that's on our policy agenda is funding for RIPTA, because we know how important it is for nonprofit employees to be able to have access to public transportation. and we have submitted testimony in favor of full funding for RIPTA. There is a hearing today in House Finance Committee about that. So if anyone wants to send any testimony. Lastly, we are having a session tomorrow with Partridge, Snow, and Hahn about the employment law implications of everything going on in the federal government. So if you or your HR staff or ED are interested, there is or anyone can participate, but particularly folks who are working with employment, there's a link, registration link in the briefing document. So that was a lot. Does anyone have questions? Robin, do you have any other announcements about programming?
I can just read off the general list.
Okay, 1 second. Bill just raised his hand. Bill.
Hello, and thank you for all of that information. I was wondering, I want to make sure that I get good information over to our finance team on their billing. Do you have you seen any examples of what the justifications look like that people are getting ahead of submitting billing?
I don't know if I have an actual example, but there are, let me see if I can find one and I can send it to you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Robin? Yeah.
Yes, I just dropped it in the chat, but it's just a list of upcoming things in the next couple of weeks. And so like Nancy said, on the 22nd, that's tomorrow, we have the Partridge, Snow, and Hahn legal learning series about employment law implications of federal law. On the 28th, we have our Impala training, which is our grants management research tool. On June 3rd, we have office hours with Eva Agudelo, and her areas of specialty are fundraising, foundation grant writing, and grants management. We have another policy briefing on the 4th of June. 16th, we have our monthly fundraising learning session. Another policy briefing on the 18th. Membership Monday on the 23rd. So that's if you want to find out about your membership, or if you're not a member yet and want to find out. And then closing out June on the 25th, we have our Intro to Clark University's MPA of Senior Leadership program. And that's it.
And we are also going to be having in July a certified nonprofit accounting professional training, a 2-day training on the 23rd and 24th. So you can mark your calendar for that as well. And I also just want to highlight again that if your organization could use technical assistance in any area right now, we are trying to expand the technical assistance we're able to provide, and can connect you with someone if you have questions about legal issues, about finance, HR, IT. Would love to make a connection for you if you have issues with any of those things. But the main thing is that if you can keep us posted, if you do receive federal funding, if you're having any issues, we are also, those of you who do receive federal funding, we are going to be sending out a survey. We have been in conversation with EOHHS, Executive Office of Health and Human Services, and in that conversation, we are made the point that even though the state understands the money that is at stake at potential terminations, they may not understand the actual implications, the bigger implications on an organization if, say, you receive 60% of your funding is federal. That may mean, you know, your organization can't survive if you lose that funding. It may not be just that that particular program shuts down, and so that could impact other programs that your community depends on. So you're going to be getting a survey about that, and would appreciate you filling that out so that we can help the state to be more proactive in thinking through the potential implications of Medicaid cuts in particular, but social service cuts more broadly. So I will stay on, but you have 15 minutes back in your schedule. If anyone has questions or wants to talk further, feel free, but otherwise have a really good rest of your day. And thanks for taking the time to join us. We'll also put this onto our YouTube channel so that if you have other colleagues who could benefit from it, they can listen.